Well, in a shocking twist of events, no one I know in real life wants to talk to me about furries. So I'm making this video. So, if you're reading the title, you know that this video will be my thoughts on Beastars. It will be broken down into chunks for your viewing pleasure, but knowing me, it won't be very organized. First up, I'm going to talk about the tensions between carnivores and herbivores. An obvious comparison to make is Zootopia because they are both set in worlds where everyone is an anthropomorphic animal, and one of the focal points of both is tensions between herbivores and carnivores. Although there are similarities, the two handle this topic very differently. While I was watching Beastars, I kept trying to figure out which real life groups of people herbivores and carnivores were supposed to represent, and I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that other stories, like Zootopia, use tensions between different species as a symbol of racism. Another is that human minds are just built for pattern recognition, so we often see patterns where there aren't any, and different correlations where maybe we shouldn't. Additionally, different minority groups do have shared experiences, although obviously they have a lot of unshared ones. Beastars shows assumptions being made about certain animals based on their species, and being stereotyped for something that is out of your control is one of the shared experiences between many, if not all, groups that face discrimination. One interesting thing about the dynamic between these two groups is that neither one is the sole victim of this social structure. Instead, they're each negatively affected in their own way. Carnivores are feared and sometimes hated. They're forced to hide certain behaviors and parts of themselves, like their fangs. Despite this, it is noted that Beastars are often carnivores, and the mare is even a carnivore. They seem to overall possess more power, although in some ways they are still oppressed. Herbivores, on the other hand, are seen as less powerful. They're kidnapped or sold on the black market to be eaten. They have less power, but they don't have to pretend to be something they're not. It's interesting how I'm describing them now. It sounds to me almost like it's the most similar to sexism in the sense that men tend to have to hide their emotions, although generally they've had more power, although that clearly falls apart under any amount of scrutiny. My mind went first to racial tensions when analyzing Beastars, like in Zootopia, but that doesn't really work. In Beastars, the carnivores genuinely do naturally behave more aggressively, unlike the animals in Zootopia and the real-life groups of people that carnivores in Zootopia represent. In Beastars, the relationship between carnivores and herbivores genuinely seems to be about that. The world and conflicts don't seem to be a direct metaphor for a specific group of people. Instead, it comes across as if the world was created and based on what society would actually be like if it was made up of anthropomorphic animals. The show seems to be less interested in holding up a mirror to our world and more interested. I love the characters in this show so much. I have been a person for many years, and despite being animals, these characters come off as more human than many actually human characters in anime. It's a weird feeling, like I relate to these furries more than a lot of human characters, and either that means the show is really well written, or I am a little weirder than I thought I was. First off, I want to talk about a character that is near and dear to my heart, Louis. I'm sorry for the pun. If I'm being honest though, I kind of hated him at first. But as you get to know him, you start to understand why he lashes out so much. His backstory, the fact that he had to fight to survive, makes his aggression and his disdain for carnivores understandable. You genuinely do start to understand why Louis acts the way he does, but I think it's important to note that he doesn't only lash out at carnivores. There's this one moment where he lashes out at a goat and makes fun of him for eating paper. And I think that mentality is still explained in part by his backstory, and his superiority and his need to lash out is explained by his backstory. But I think him lashing out at someone like a goat is definitely a lot less understandable than him lashing out at a carnivore. It doesn't make him a bad character by any means. In fact, I think it's interesting, but it did make him less likable to me. I really like Legoshi's character, and not just because yandere are scarce. He's a genuinely good character. As the series goes on, we get to know Legoshi more and more. Obviously, physically, he is a wolf, but he presents in a very awkward and unthreatening way, and beneath that, he keeps his carnivore instincts hidden. He's like a wolf in sheep's clothing in wolf's clothing. I did like Legoshi's character a lot throughout the series, but there was one big problem I had with his development that I think didn't really add up. The show starts with an alpaca named Tem being killed. Legoshi was friends with him, but he's never shown grieving. The ramifications we see of Tem's death are mostly on the culture of the school as a whole. We see it in the tensions between the carnivores and the herbivores, but we never see Legoshi really caring for Tem as a friend outside of the first episode. I just think it could have been a really cool arc seeing Legoshi come to terms with his friend's death, especially what that means for him in the context of him being a carnivore. But instead, what we got is Legoshi telling Tem's crush about him, being sad for 5 seconds, getting hangry once, and then forgetting about him. I really like the romance in the show. Legoshi is infatuated with Haru at first because he wants to kill her, but he explores his feelings for her, and I think, in the sense of him actually being attracted to her, the development there is well done. The more interesting character, though, at least to me when it comes to relationships, is Haru. She struggles the whole show with people seeing her as something that must be protected and pitying her when all she wants is for them to treat her as an equal. This explains why she likes Legoshi and why she likes her dear Louis. We don't get to see a lot of Haru and Louis together, but the show effectively shows us why they would be such a good match. Louis has a lot of fangirls and gets a lot of attention, but when he first meets Haru, Haru notes that people have expected him to be perfect. He clearly has lots of pressure on him to act a certain way. When Haru and Louis first meet, she takes care of him after his antlers fall off, and even refuses money for her troubles. This explains why Louis likes Haru. He can be vulnerable around her. Conversely, Haru likes Louis because he doesn't pity her. When they first meet, she's the one that takes care of him. They love each other because in this relationship, they can both be who they are and they don't have these expectations placed upon them. Beastars is a generally very well written show, but because I'm me and I'm nitpicky, I want to talk about some things that didn't quite make sense to me. And I'm just gonna go through a list because I don't have a better way to organize this. How do dogs and wolves exist if humans aren't around to domesticate wolves and make them dogs? Why is there a bed in the gardening shed? I don't understand how Haru had the money for that, and if she didn't put it up there, why was it there in the first place? It seems suspicious that they would allow that. Bill says that the blood that he has isn't a student's blood. Then he later says a senior gave it to him. Haru puts her arm in Legoshi's mouth and says, quote, "It's like my body's just trying to be eaten," end quote. It's implied that this is because she's an herbivore and that this is just naturally her instincts, but that doesn't make sense because an herbivore's instincts primarily revolve around trying not to become someone's prey. It's kind of weird that the school assumes that Legoshi and Haru are just spending the night elsewhere instead of assuming that he's eaten her, especially after Tem's murder. Now we're going to do the random thought section. This will also just be a rapid fire list because, like I said, I am disorganized. So, episode 7 starts with a hen talking about the quality of her eggs and how she's proud of them. This is very out of left field and quite frankly very strange. I kind of love it though because it's hilarious, and knowing that other characters have stuff going on that's completely unrelated to the main characters and plot makes the world feel real. This may be a weird comparison, but during the Chimera Ant arc in Hunter x Hunter, There's a random episode dedicated to this character named Jiro. Jiro does appear later, but his backstory comes episodes before we meet him. So when you're watching him, it feels very random. Additionally, this backstory is not relevant to like anything else that happens. I can't explain why, but in both shows, it just kind of works. You know, I mean, it just feels like there's a real world and we're just going to take some time to explore something that doesn't matter. And that's kind of how real life is. Not everything leads to progressing an overarching thing. Although it is kind of weird from a story perspective. You would think it would make it feel really unfocused, but to me it always just kind of works. It feels like these are real worlds that have been built and we're just taking a little detour through the world from the main character. It's like a side plot, but like really far off to the side. Kind of like how in a video of Beastars, I just decided to jump ship right over to Hunter x Hunter. I hope this random detour works as well as it did in Beastars and Hunter x Hunter. Guess we'll have to see. In episode 7, Haru mentions Bambi to Louie, and Louie doesn't know who Bambi is. Does Disney exist or not exist in this universe? Why doesn't Louie know about it? I kind of just realized it's because he had a very messed up childhood, and now I'm sad. In a weird way, though, Bambi does kind of work as a symbol for Louie. They both had very rough childhoods, and Bambi eventually becomes the great prince of the forest. Louie is also under the expectation that he will become the Beastar, that he will be some great prince. Now, the eternal question with anime watchers is sub or dub, and I actually prefer both because I like to be able to compare the differences. Now, this is all relevant because when Legoshi tries to convince Louie to help him rescue Haru, Louie declines. In the dub, Legoshi asks if he likes Haru and then says that Haru likes him. In the sub, however, Legoshi asks if Louie loves her and says that she loves him. Louie then gets mad and punches Legoshi in the face. This eventually devolves into them fighting. I like the sub more in this case because it's pretty clear that Louie and Haru like each other, and also in this instance, Haru's life is at stake. Being reminded that you're letting someone you like die is probably a lot less painful than being reminded that someone you love is going to die. This means that in the sub version, Louie's response is a lot more understandable and warranted. And I like that version better because it means you can more clearly understand the perspective of Louie. The perspective of Legoshi was already pretty understandable, and I think it makes it better that they're both doing things that aren't 100% in the right. There's a point where Legoshi tells Louie that Haru will be his. I understand that Legoshi loves Haru and in this moment shows he's more dedicated to her than Louie, but honestly I still don't like this line. I hate it in general when two characters fight over who gets to be with someone. The person who they're fighting over is the person that should get to decide who they want to be with. There's no point in getting in a fist fight because the winner of a fist fight won't get Haru. The person that Haru chooses will. And all fighting shows is that you're immature and that you don't respect the person in the middle of this enough to let them decide on their own. They're a person. They can choose who they want to be with. I really like the awkwardness in this show. It's really well done. I think that sometimes when shows try to write in awkward characters, they're just like, ooh, she's awkward and clumsy. This character trips over her own 2 feet, but only when it's cute and convenient for the plot. In this show, the awkwardness feels real, like when Legoshi and Haru are first having dinner together, and he's staring at her because he just doesn't know what to say. Despite this, they do eventually become friends, and this awkwardness isn't wholly necessary for the plot. But I like that it's still there because it just goes with how their characters would interact with one another. So that concludes my first video. I hope you enjoyed. If anyone has managed to make it this far by some miracle, I apologize, first of all, for the audio quality, and second of all, for my general level of cringe. I hope you enjoyed anyways, somehow, if you managed. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I just made this because I wanted to talk about anime, so please feel free to let me know your thoughts on Beastars or your thoughts on my thoughts on Beastars. Either way, I hope you have a lovely day, and I hope at least someone sees this. Goodbye.